Okay, the name is Charles Nelson. I'm currently totally retired, so I have no real affiliation at this moment. Well, my great strength and my great weakness is that I'm interested in everything. And this doesn't just go for archaeology, it extends far beyond. And so that's a really hard, question to to answer. And I've sort of gone through phases. I worked in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm probably most noted for the Sunset Creek Report and all the various discussions it has spawned. And then I went off to Africa, where I ended up specializing in the Pastoral Neolithic for the most part, with first early stone or late Stone Age and then Pastoral Neolithic. So things, in other words, things changed through time. And of course, when I came back here, I largely just sort of picked up bits and pieces that I had left incomplete. And that's what I've been working on since coming back, sort of for the last 10 years or so. My family used to live in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities. And my father had done the equivalent of a degree in geology at the University of Minnesota. And in fact, for a time right after World War II, he worked for an oil company in the Badlands, prospecting for kinds of formations that oil might be buried under. And his hobbies included mineralogy and paleontology. And so we collected rocks and fossils in Minnesota. This is when I was a little kid. So at 5 and 6 years old, I was going out and collecting this sort of thing. Then in 1950, he was offered a position with the Great Northern Railroad in their electrical engineering department. He had a degree in electrical engineering as well, here in Seattle. And so we moved. So I was 8 at the time. And of course, we continued collecting rocks and minerals and fossils when we got out here. And so it didn't matter whether we were collecting petrified wood in the Saddle Mountains or Thompsonite up at Monty Lake in British Columbia, or agates down at Silver Lake on the west side of the mountains here. Everywhere we went, we also found Indian artifacts. And so the question is, what means these things? You see? And so we went sort of to find out. We decided, well, we needed archaeologists, so we found Douglas Osborne at the University of Washington. And he also happened to live just a few blocks away from where we lived, up on Capitol Hill in Seattle. And he was glad to talk to us and educate us a little bit. And in addition, it soon became clear that his graduate students desperately needed free labor. I think Roy Carlson may have been one. Whether it was Clay Denman. Gee, there were a couple of others whose names I don't remember now right offhand, but certainly those two. Essentially, I was the laborer for graduate students and somebody who also helped out from time to time in the museum. So I started working for his graduate students here in Western Washington, up in places like Camano Island and Whidbey Island and the Skagit River and so forth, just on weekends and holidays, just as a crew member. And Doug was also recruiting other young men for his for this purpose, one of whom was David Rice. Okay, and so this soon then sort of got our parents interested, and that was the genesis of the Washington Archaeological Society. There was first a group of students that was organized and worked for his graduate students essentially, and then this morphed into the Washington Archaeological Society. And so I was soon working with Borden up in British Columbia, and I was on Caldwell's last excavation in the Northwest down in Hell's Canyon, and with Osborne's last excavation in the Northwest over at Dry Falls, and so on and so forth. And Gringo's first excavation down operating out of the Figure 2 Ranch, and which was an interesting experience, to say the least. So anyway, that's the genesis of the interest in archaeology. Well, both my parents were members of the Washington Archaeological Society. My father was president for a number of years, and he also was editor of the Washington Archaeologist for a number of years. And in fact, he did a number of research papers which were published in the Washington Archaeologist. One on graphite sources in Washington, another one on the earliest full survey of the Columbia River and the relationship between the ethnographic information that was known and all the names and everything on the maps, that kind of thing. When Doug Osborne was still around and sort of in charge, he had been trained in the old 10-foot square method, okay? Because his degree was from out east and whatnot. And this was Gringo's training as well, interestingly enough. And so we were actually excavating at KT6, and at there's another little site just north of the Saddle Mountains, a little housepit site there where we worked with Doug, and all of that work was in 10-foot squares, which is really not suitable for what was happening. And we very quickly switched to 5-foot squares and excavated things then in 5-foot squares. And really the techniques of excavation and so forth evolved through time and became more sophisticated as we went along. But generally speaking, it was arbitrary 6-inch levels in 5-foot squares, and with only a modest amount of attention to the stratigraphy as such. Okay. And essentially the same system that Gringo and his students were using, actually, back then. Of course, all of our work was in the nature of salvage archaeology in the East, and so speed was very important, since we had limited number of days on any site where we went. So it was arbitrary 6-inch levels. Everything was profiled, and soil samples and so forth were taken, and the material was either cataloged in the field or was cataloged immediately after leaving the field, depending on how long we were in the field. Level bags were kept with material that wasn't actually measured. Stuff found in situ was, of course, measured in using line level for the vertical control, and the line levels are then all tied into a particular corner square of the 5-foot square. And of course the profiles showed the contour of the surface, so you knew where all those measurements came from. Yes, everything was screened, and level bags were kept, but not everything was saved. So it was a representative sample that was saved, and this was true as well for example, Gringo's excavations and Osborne's excavations, Butler's excavations. Pretty much everybody at the time was just saving samples of what was going through the screen, and that was true for us as well. So the first sort of complete sample, 100% samples that I think were taken were in the lower horizons at KT-28 at the Sunset Creek site. There, everything was saved. But for the most part, with the exception of cultural component 3, the assemblage sizes were quite small. So you weren't saving huge quantities of material. And of course, for many of those horizons, there were no fossil remains. Yeah. So it was simply stone. They were quarter-inch screens, yes. And no fine fractions were saved by anybody. Oh, I should say in the screening at places like KT-28, and I'm not certain about, I can't remember about KT-6 how much was saved there, but for example at KT-28, anything that looked like an identifiable bone was saved as part of the level bag samples. Well, it was a family activity, and certainly our family, and David Rice, obviously, and a number of sort of high school students from time to time, associated mainly with Garfield High School. So that would have included William Wood, who I think is an emeritus now professor from Stanford at the moment. Include Tom King, who's a retired physicist. He's sort of a Cold War physicist involved in the defense industry. And Evans, what was his first name? He did later then work for Wendorf in North Africa, but then dropped out of archaeology, and I don't really know what became of him. And then in terms of other families, there were the Bedells, and there were the Welds, both Mr. and Mrs. Weld and his daughter, Tracy, who was a fantastic artist. And I think she sort of went on, at least for a time, in anthropology, but I don't really know what her career was like. And then there were the Thompsons. He was the one that found the Snoqualmie site, 45 SN100, or he didn't actually, well, he found it after it had been reported, but nobody knew where it was, kind of thing. And he also did all the high terrace work in western Washington that was initially done on the Olcott assemblages, and reported those in the Washington Archaeologists. Then there was Charlie Heller, who was, I think, a retired police officer and collector, and who's only recently passed away, actually, amazingly enough. And there were a number of graduate students, of course, people like Clay Denman, who were members and who participated frequently here. And there were other people as well, but those are the principal ones. And later on in time, people like Estrada Onat were heavily involved in the society. We must have had I would say about 25 or 30 really active members, highly active members, and then another 25 or 30 semi-active members. My recollection is I think that we had, during the winter, we had like monthly meetings, and during the summer we were mainly out excavating. So people met at excavations. We didn't really, except we didn't as part of the Washington Archaeological Society. We did have later, when the summer I worked for Gringo, we got involved with Frank Buck and went around with him some. I and David and a couple of other people from Gringo's excavation crew. But that wasn't the Washington Archaeological Society at all. And David, of course, went on to develop a very close relationship with a number of the Indian groups, not just the Yakima, but the Colville, Federated Tribes, and those folks. The Washington Archaeologist was essentially published from home, and it was published initially out of our house, and all the photographic work was taken to I don't remember what the photographic house was, but the one that specialized in doing plates and everything for magazines and newspapers and all that kind of stuff. And so that's how those were created or prepared. And then it was essentially mimeographed and run off that way with the various pages for plates and everything inserted, and the profile drawings and everything. Well, I think the WAS published something like 6 separate publications, one of which was on KT6, and a number of the others were things that weren't done by the society but were submitted for publication to us. And of course, the monograph on KT28 was done. A number of other things were really taken over by other people. So SK33, for example, was taken over by Estrida Onat and then others after her. And they really took the WAS collections and incorporated that data and incorporated that into their work, and was subsequently published that way. SN100 has a whole series of publications that are in the Washington Archaeologists, and those I think are the major ones. The other ones that were done, we were really helping other people, like we were helping Osborne excavate that house pit site, or one of his graduate students who worked at Ginkgo State Park for a while. We helped on one of those excavations, things of that nature. Well, we were of course based in Seattle and in the Seattle area, and so we were working on sites here in Western Washington. But then the dams started being built on the Middle Columbia, and so we essentially were pressed into service doing salvage work over there. So KT6 and KT28 were both approached as salvage operations, and we did some surveying for Osborne down on the just south of the Saddle Mountains on on the west side of the river, and in a few other places as well. And well, we were at KT-28 working there, and we used to work, like a week or 10 days in the spring and a week or 10 days in the summer. And during those times, there would, not always, but on a number of occasions, there were collectors that came and excavated things. And indeed, if you look at my website and the KT-28 section there, and you go to things like the pipes, you'll see that added, these were not in the original report, but added on the website version of the report, there are some fancy pipes and some carved LLs and, incised LLs and things like that, which were found by such people. And interestingly enough, the PUD, at least I assume it was the PUD, did an overflight of the reservoir just before it was flooded. And this was after our excavation was complete and after Sonia Solon's excavation was complete. Because you can see both sets of excavations in the photographs. And on the beach, you can see that there are like a dozen or more boats parked on the beach. These are all collectors madly digging away, getting their last licks in. In eastern Washington, absolutely, there was considerable impact on the sites where we worked. Here in western Washington, there was not. Barkey is another member who also worked at KT-28 at the Sunset Creek site. And both he and Weld had worked at this site as collectors previously. And but they had, in both cases, kept all the artifacts together and kept notes. Barkey's notebook was quite detailed, actually, level by level, and what was found in some profiles that he did, and maps of features and things. Ted did not have that, but he only worked in one house pit, and so it was all together as a single assemblage. So yes, we had members, although most of the members had started out as collectors, so they had history as collectors before they joined the society. Well, all of the stuff essentially was property of the society, and went to the idea would be that when it had been analyzed, it would go to an appropriate repository. Well, it was the Grant County PUD initially when it went over for KT-28 and KT-6, and the material on this side of the mountains went initially to a Streetas program, and then I think to the Burke. Oh, well, I could name many. One is, and you'll see, for example, in KT-28, you'll see this in report. There's in the upper Luss stratum, which is the last 2,000 years essentially. That's divided into a whole series of subcomponents, which go from A to L, so there are quite a number of them. But then there's something called UND, undesignated, and you will see that assemblage is larger than any of the other assemblages that have been sort of put in order in time and whatnot, and associated with specific features. And that is because we were excavating in 5-foot squares and for the most part in, just 6-inch levels across 5-foot squares. And so where you're crossing boundaries between the fill in the house pit and what's outside the house pit and therefore older, you don't know. You have an artifact that hasn't been measured in, you don't know where to actually assign it. And so what does it become? It becomes undesignated. And so that's a real big drawback in the data. A second big drawback is that there's no fine fraction analysis, as we didn't use window screen. So we don't have, we can't tell you for certain, for example, whether the projectile points that we find at the site were made there or made someplace else and brought there. We can't tell you how heavily scrapers were resharpened before they were discarded. We can't give you probably accurate figures on microfauna. So there are a whole series of things which fine fraction analysis allows you to do, but if you don't have any fine fraction saved, then you can't do that. So that's obviously a big limitation. And of course, one of the big limitations for that site was the time that we had to excavate it. As a high school student, which is when I excavated that site, had I actually had money to stick around, for like 3 months at a time, we would have had a much richer assemblage, and one which is much easier to interpret in much greater detail, particularly for the early materials at the site, the stuff that's older than 2,000 years. So those would be the kind of limitations for those sites. If you don't have whole collections, you don't have whole stories. It's really pretty simple. Yeah, and also archives and centers like the one up in Heritage Center are the places where whole collections go. That's where they belong, because they have the facilities to store them and to make them available to people who want to study them and use them for comparative purposes and so forth. So, whole collections, it's very important to preserve entire collections whenever possible. Well, it sort of gradually sputtered out. I wasn't around when it actually came to an end. For example, I did a little paper on a carbon-14 date that I had run on SN 100, sort of late in their game, and I sent it to them, published it there, really as an effort to help keep them alive. and I also did technically I guess the society may still exist since I'm a life member. I purchased a life membership again to help keep them afloat back in the 70s. So, but that it was just not to be. I'm just trying to remember if anybody, of course, the Mid-Columbia Archaeological Society, that Dave was involved in, the founding of that, but I don't think the members of that, I don't know that any of the members of that had been members of the Washington Archaeological Society. There was another collector who joined our society by the name of Gordy Lalander, and he didn't like the fact he couldn't keep the artifacts, and so he broke off and formed a society whose name I'd have to look up right now. Essentially of a half a dozen people who went out and collected in the old-fashioned way, mainly on the Snake River, I think. Well, of course, I started, my first earliest publications were when I was in high school, and that was Garfield High School. And the high school itself didn't have anything to do with that, particularly. The Washington Archaeological Society did. There aren't very many venues in which high school students can sort of run an excavation and then publish. So this was such a venue, and that's what the Coronet Bay site IS-31B report on that. The report on the flake stone tool assemblage from SN100, and the report on KT28 all sort of grew out of that. I knew when I was in high school that I was going to become an archaeologist, so I was one of those few students that actually had a trajectory. And later on, when I entered the professorial ranks, I found that very few students wanted to talk about the future at all in any way, shape, or form, which I found curious. Anyway, so I went to Seattle University for 2 years with the intention of then transferring over to Washington State University. They did have one anthropologist teaching there, Virginia Watson, the wife of Jim Watson, who was a professor at the U of W. And she was quite a good teacher, and so I took every course that she offered. And then just whatever sort of upper division course I could finagle my way into as a freshman and then a sophomore, because I didn't like introductory level courses very much. I then spent an extra year at Pullman, so I spent 3 years at Pullman so that I could take soils with Smith and his crowd, and so that I could take a full range of geology courses, including glacial geology and geomorphology and historical geology, and that kind of range of things. And then I went off to, at that point, and of course I'd been working throughout those years, and for Doherty, essentially doing surveys and excavations for him, and pulling David Rice over into that milieu as well, from the U of W. And so we together surveyed 3 reservoirs on the Snake River, and excavated also 45 CO1, the Buchanan site, which was all work for Doherty, and we worked as well in Mount Rainier one summer, doing the west half. Doherty did the east half, we did the west half. And this was part of David Rice's beginning interest in Indians and trails and so forth across the Cascades, and trade routes and other kinds of ethnographic contacts between the East and the West. Came partly out of that. And then I decided that while finishing up in my third year, I was also taking graduate courses. So I had taken graduate seminars at WSU, and by the time I had sort of was in that final year and applying for graduate school, I had by that point pretty much decided that I wanted to get a different perspective on archaeology. I had sort of drained everybody's mind in Washington and in terms of what was happening, so I decided I wanted to get a totally new perspective. So I applied sort of widely. I was accepted in 7 programs, and I decided to go to Berkeley, even though there was no money attached to Berkeley. I had very generous scholarship offers from some very prominent archaeologists from the Midwest and on the East Coast, but I decided that if I was going to get a new perspective, I'd get a new perspective and do old world archaeology, get my training in that, and then decide what to do after I had that training. The only thing that I did, substantive thing that I did afterwards, well, of course, I published little things like that, the C-14 date from SN100, but I ended up doing the archaeology of the Puget Sound Basin for the Handbook of North American Indians. And otherwise, I was pretty much firmly just involved in East African archaeology and a little bit in Massachusetts because we had a field school to train students there. Well, it's changed hugely. And I think that the technical and technological changes are well understood in terms of how they've developed. Computers being one. When I started, we were literally using hand calculators to do things, and now we have wonderful computers that greatly improve our productivity, and of course the rise of genetics and all that entails, and the rise of a whole host of dating techniques. So these are I think the main sort of technological drivers of how archaeology has changed. But as important, maybe even more important than that, has been the context in which archaeology is conducted. So when I started, you could pretty much call your own shots in terms of where you worked and what problem you worked on and so on and so forth. Now, archaeology is so hedged around with a great variety of bureaucracies and political constraints and so forth that it's much more difficult to actually, has become progressively much more difficult to do archaeology in places like the States. I think that, the heavy hand of bureaucracy and the way laws are written and things has some fallout that is not necessarily so good. On the other hand, there are some very good things that come out of it because there are some large projects which do seminal excavations and lead to the accumulation of real useful knowledge. I go wherever the archaeology leads me, essentially. I'm not very dogmatic about my archaeology. I'm more eclectic. So if it's useful, I use it. The things that other archaeologists have found most useful in the work that I have done is when I am essentially telling a story, constructing something that is not purely descriptive and is not narrowly analytical, but has some larger framework in mind and which attempts to contribute to that framework. Those are the things that I have written that people remark on to me, and they tend to get cited in the literature as well. Not the pieces that are highly narrowly focused or narrowly driven by one point of view or another point of view. I don't know that these are milestones, but these are sort of light bulb moments, as it were. These are the things that one tends to remember. So, for example, when I and David Rice were working in the Asotin Dam Reservoir, where there's a very large number of sites representing the last couple of thousand years. There's some earlier material as well, but the later material is very well displayed there. It suddenly occurred to me that, and you have to remember that we're down on a canyon, the Snake River Canyon, which is essentially a gorge. It's quite narrow. And so you get up, you're above the sort of level of the rock, of the actual, where the water is going to come in the dam, and you've gone up there to take pictures, showing the relationship between sites and things. I'm looking down, and I suddenly realize that we can define communities, something beyond what an individual site. We can actually see, when you're looking down up here, you can see associations of sites which must have formed communities. So you have a habitation site with house pits, you have cemeteries, you have storage rock shelters, you have a whole series of things. You have fish wells for mooring boats and dip netting and so on and so forth. And you can actually draw lines around these things. And so we did, and we called these site complexes. Okay, so that was sort of when suddenly I moved from thinking about sites to thinking about communities of people. Okay, so that was a big transformation right there, and that got reflected in the papers that we wrote, and in fact the contract fulfillment paper on the Soton Dam Reservoir as well. So that was one thing. Well, for the material from KT-28, the Sunset Creek site, since the site has played a big role, I'd like to see the second excavation from that integrated into it, the one that was done under Gringo's direction, and I would like to see the collections developed in such a way that they were a useful teaching tool at sort of all levels, right up to graduate level. So there are a number of hypotheses and things that could easily be dissected in different ways at the graduate level, for example. And on the other hand, there's some very basic material that you could be familiarizing, primary and secondary school children with. And most importantly, the Colville and Wanapum Indians themselves. And 45 KT6, which you have, which is not as useful a collection for these things, but that site still exists. So what I would hope for would be that, what my wish would be that the Colville and Wanapum Indians became interested in training some of their own people to be archaeologists, at a regular high level, and that they would use, for example, the site at KT6 as a learning facility in the early stages of this process, to take people who were high school age and college age and give them the basic training so that they could then be farmed out to other institutions around Eastern Washington, such as Central, to do other kinds of work and get other kinds of experience and degrees, and eventually come back to be tribal archaeologists. So I think that would be a very a useful thing for that side. And in the later stages of that kind of development, the Sunset Creek site would also be quite useful. Well, I would say, first of all, get experience in the field. If you don't have experience in the field, you'll never really understand what's on those museum shelves. And when you see the actual problems of what's happening in the field, how the sausage is made, as it were, then it gives you an appreciation for what you can do within a museum collection and what you can't do. And it also gives you a much better understanding of the context for archaeological materials. So you need to get field work under your belt, as much of it as you can, as early as you can. And you need to do this in a variety of settings. So not just at one site or at one set of sites in a small geographic area. So you need to get as sort of far afield, see as many different kinds of archaeological sites and problems in the field, close up and dirty as you can. So that would be my number one piece of advice. The second piece of advice is, in terms of your education, your formal education, you need to be very purposeful in the way you go about that. So from what you've seen in the field and what you've read in archaeology, you will have an idea of what things are important, particularly important. And you should be thinking, when you're signing up for courses, which courses are going to be most useful to me as an archaeologist. And that's going to take you beyond the anthropology department in which you find yourself doing a major. So it will take you into geology, it will take you into soil science, it will take you into biology, it may take you into chemistry and physics. But you need to build a set of things, both in anthropology and outside anthropology, which you can knit together into whatever your focus is within archaeology. And the other thing is, you need the rest of anthropology besides archaeology. You need, unless you're planning to work with, early hominids, go off to Africa or something, work with things that are 2 or 3 million years old. You really need to understand modern cultures and the range of cultures and cultural behaviors. You need, in other words, cultural and social anthropology. You need to be able to appreciate things like the skeleton, so you need biological anthropology, and you need a good course in how you work with the anatomy of skeletons and that kind of thing. There are a series of things like this that you can take in an anthropology department which are not archaeology, but you should be taking them. And because that's what's going to make you, it will make you think more broadly, and it will put the archaeological material into a much better behavioral context than it would normally. So those would be the two most important things that I would stress. Well, you're called upon as a field archaeologist to do all kinds of strange things. So, for example, when we were at the Toucannon site, the mouth of the Toucannon River, we had a deep control block, several meters deep, from out of which we controlled the stratigraphy for the site. And we were backfilling this sort of on the last day in preparation to going out. And we'd filled in most of it. We still had about, I'd say 6 or 7 feet to go. And one of the, we had two, the entire field crew was David Rice, myself, and a couple of students, high school students from Pullman. And so we were backfilling, and one of the students decided he was going to, I don't know what he had to get or do, but he was going to jump down into the pit rather than walking around. Walking around would have been, 20 steps or something. But no, he was going to jump. They'd been told, never jump in a pit, never ever jump in a pit. Under any circumstances, do not jump. But he jumped, and he broke his wrist. So I had to go down there and I set his wrist. And I did this by saying, okay, grit your teeth. And then I grabbed him by the forearm and I pulled the hand out like this. And I just let it back in like that. And made a little sling for him. Walked him up to the cab of our truck and gave him an aspirin or two. and said, okay, when we finish backfilling, we'll drive you into Pullman. And that's what we did. And it came out fine. In fact, the doctor said, when I took him in, I stayed in with him, and the doctor looked at him and they said, who set this wrist? And I thought, oh God, I've done something wrong. And I said, well, I did, actually. And he said, you'd make a fine doctor. So I knew I had a second career if I wanted it. Then there was the time down in Hell's Canyon when Chris Hulse, who was the son of the biological anthropologist Hulse, who at the time, in the late 60s, early 70s, had the book that everybody was using in university courses, the introductory level book in biological anthropology, then called physical anthropology. So it was his son, Chris Hulse, was also down on the working for Warren Caldwell, down in Hell's Canyon. And so when we were down on, I guess it was Eagle Bar, sort of as far down as you could drive, we had a camp down there, and we're working on a late house pit site. And we had weekends off, so we used to go hiking and things. And so I and Chris Hulse and a third person, whose name I don't remember anymore, were up exploring rock faces. And we had taken sandwiches for lunch to go. And so we got up there and we were walking along a rock ledge sort of at the top of a long talus slope, that kind of thing. And it was lunchtime, so we decided to sit down and eat. And we sat down and on this ledge that was sticking out, and we ate. And Chris was the first one who was sitting in the middle, was the first one to get up. And as soon as he got up, a rattle started from a rattlesnake. And he had been sitting on one all through lunch without knowing it. And the rattlesnake, in consequence, the rattlesnake had a broken back at a couple of places. It was not in any condition to strike anybody. So we put the poor snake out of its misery and went on about our way. Oh, and then there was another very humorous one. And this was when working for Osborne in the Dry Falls State Park. We were, one of the sites that we excavated was at the height of a very tall talus slope. There was one of these long rock shelters with nothing but sort of roof fall in it, but occupied. And the most interesting thing in it was a pit filled with little tiny fragments of bone, which had been boiled to get all of the collagen and so forth out of them. And so they were very, very light and porous. And there was sort of a pit filled with these things where they had been dumped after the boiling process was done. So that was probably the most significant thing in the site. It wasn't a very nice site. But there was a long, long trail across the talus, diagonal trail leading up to it, because it was like, it was probably 150 feet high talus slope, so it was a long ways up. And there was a road down below, and of course tourists were coming to the park all the time, and they used to see our truck parked down there, and then they used to see us up there on the rock face, and they used to see the trail, and putting, one thing together with another, they would decide to come up and visit us. Well, what they didn't know is that in the middle of this trail, going up the talus, there was this big basalt slab that was maybe 2 feet across on each side, and it tilted, so it wasn't stable. It would go ka-clunk and ka-clunk when you stepped on it. It wouldn't go down very far, just an inch or inch and a half or so, but it made a nice thunking sound when you went down. But there was a rattlesnake that lived underneath it. So every time you went across this thing, the snake would go off. It was sort of like a doorbell. And so we used to have fun watching the tourists scatter across the talus slope when they came to this point. And then the thing was, which tourists would bet about this, which tourists would go back, and which tourists would be persistent to get past the rattlesnake. And this was also a very peculiar year, because it was a year, there was a very lush spring, and then very dry, and we actually had bad brush fires that year, and lots of sheet lightning that would go all across the sky. And but the rattlesnakes that year were all green. And I mean really green, almost grass green. And they had the typical markings and everything else. But they were all very, very green to match the vegetation.